Claims that perfume is art are hardly new, but the recent exhibition, The Art of Scent, 1889 to 2012, at New York's Museum of Arts and Design, has raised the issue of the art status of olfactory works in general, and perfume in particular, in a more acute way. Of course, artworks that incorporate odors have been around a long time, and we are indebted to Jim Drobnik for apprising us of the great variety of contemporary olfactory experiments. Yet the Museum of Arts and Design's exhibition ignored this recent history to feature a dozen perfumes dating from 1889 to the present. Each scent was dispensed from an opening in the gallery wall, you have a picture of it, as if it were a series of paintings, accompanied by the title, date, and artist's name. By this presentational conceit, along with a guidebook and signage redolent with the tropes of art history, the curator, Chandler Burr, hoped to convince visitors that perfumes are, quote, actually works of art, equal in terms to painting, sculpture, music, architecture, and film. To judge by critical reviews and a check on the internet of numerous blogs, many visitors enjoyed the idea of perfumes as works of high art, although a significant minority of critics found the claims overblown and unconvincing. My primary aim, of course, today isn't to critique an exhibition, but to talk about the general question of the art status of perfume. Rather than begin by offering a formal definition of either perfume or art, I'm going to talk about some characteristics of each that come into play when someone makes a claim like perfume is art. To begin with, perfume, I will assume, is the common commercial product that we all know, a scent composed to be worn on the body to enhance one's self-presentation. Composed of artificial scent molecules supplemented by essential oils, most perfumes are products of the luxury and fashion industry that releases hundreds of new perfumes a year. Although I'll focus on fine perfume in this primary meaning of scents to wear on the body, we shouldn't forget the broader reach of the perfumery industry, such as the integration of scents into products of everyday life, like toothpaste and soaps, the development of ambient odors for buildings, and of course, the creation of so many artificial flavors. With respect to the concept of art, we might begin by asking how art is being used in a phrase like perfume is art. In the case of the Museum of Arts and Design, as well as in the writings of several perfumers I've read, the term art seems to be used extensionally as a prestigious umbrella category, covering subcategories like painting, sculpture, music, and so on. In other words, the traditional category of fine art. But the term art in the phrase perfume is art could also be used in a much broader sense that embraces almost any human making done with skill and grace, as when we speak of something as an art, or use the phrase the art of cooking, medicine, politics. And somewhere in between these innumerable worldly arts and the category of fine art fall all those other more or less organized practice we often designate by putting a modifier in front of art, such as applied arts, commercial arts, decorative arts, along with such practices as design and craft, which are also considered widely as arts in this ordinary sense. Thus, even though common usage might suggest that the term arts in the plural refers to a vast continuum with no strict boundaries within it, another common usage maintains the traditional division of the arts into the fine arts on one side and applied or decorative art or design on the other. Of course, this dualism can also be expressed in many other terms: high versus low, major versus minor, capital A art versus small a art, or coinages like Collingwood's art proper versus craft, or John Passmore's serious art versus entertainment. Most of the time, of course, ordinary discourse has a context that roughly lets us know which sense of art we're using. Of course, there's also a long tradition of trying to overcome these variously named dualisms. And there are some critics today who would claim that the line between the two areas has blurred to the point of disappearing. Yet there's plenty of evidence that these dualisms persist, precisely when issues like the status of some everyday or applied art like perfume is in play. For example, in a book that appeared just a few months ago, Arthur Danto uses the phrase, quote, art with a capital A, in arguing that Andy Warhol's work Brillo Box is fine art, whereas the design which copied James Harvey's Brillo shipping carton is merely commercial art. A few months before Danto's book appeared, Zoe Ryan, a curator of design at the Art Institute in Chicago, applied the same kind of distinction, but to opposite effect, claiming that the fashion designs of three firms they were exhibiting, Bless, Boudica, and Sandra Backlund, quote, can no longer be explored as a purely commercial endeavor, since their conceptual approach has the effect of, quote, elevating their fashion designs to the status of fine art. And just a decade earlier, Carolyn Korsmeyer's influential book on gustatory taste invoked both the fine art versus applied art and major versus minor contrasts in arguing that fine cuisine and wine, while they manifest many aesthetic and artistic properties, should not be considered part of the fine arts. And of course, just this last year, Kane Todd took issue with Korsmeyer, developing a spirited case as to why we should, quote, elevate fine wine onto the pedestal of art. You did say that. Without going into a close analysis of these polarities, I want to emphasize two rather obvious aspects of these dualisms. First, the popular assumption that to move something from the applied art or design category to the fine art category is an elevation. Second, the frequently encountered assumption that the fine or high arts are meant to be appreciated for themselves, that is, primarily for their aesthetic and artistic properties, whereas works of applied art or design, while they have aesthetic or artistic properties, are to be judged for the way they serve some practical purpose. Now, this broad polarity still hangs on, especially when claims are made for the art status of things like fashion, food, wine, or perfume. I think recalling a bit of extensional history might illuminate at least one aspect of the claim that we treat perfume as art. When the new category of fine art came into being in the 18th century, it was already somewhat variable, although most writers agreed on the famous five core of poetry, painting, sculpture, architecture, and music, in contrast to what were then called the, quote, mechanical arts. But equally important for our topic, the new category of fine arts emerged hand in hand with new institutions like the Art Museum, so that over the course of the 19th century, as the term mechanical arts dropped out of use and people talked about applied or decorative arts, separate museums for these arts began to appear across Europe. In America, they just put separate departments into museums. But almost as soon as the fine art category and its institutions became firmly established, a process of assimilation began, starting with the debate over whether photography, invented in 1839, should be considered a fine art. Over the last 100 years, the category of fine art and its institutions like the Art Museum or the Symphony Hall has not only absorbed new art forms such as photography and film, along with tribal carvings, jazz, quilts. It has even taken in the Dadaist, Fluxist, and conceptual gestures that were meant to challenge it. And since the 1970s, the process of assimilation has accelerated, due partly to the fact that artists began to use any material, action, or gesture as a vehicle for art making, including, of course, the medium of odors. Most artworks that foreground odors, of course, have been done as part of installation, performance, or participation approaches. And these have easily entered the circuit of fine art institutions and criticism. But it's not only the materials, once identified with applied arts or crafts, things like clay, glass, fiber, that have been embraced as legitimate vehicles for high art. But applied art genres and techniques themselves have been selectively taken in. For example, the awarding of the Turner Prize to Grayson Perry for his narrative pottery, or the Art Museum shows honoring fashion designers like Cardin, Armani, and McQueen, or the Guggenheim Museum's notorious Art of the Motorcycle exhibition. Given this history of assimilation, it might seem that the inclusion of perfume was a foregone conclusion. And on a purely procedural version of the institutional theory of art, like George Dickey's, that would be the end of the matter. Yet, as many people have pointed out, whoever speaks or acts on behalf of an institution must have some reasons for their decision, unless we are to accept mere fiat. The fact that the Guggenheim Museum exhibits motorcycles or Armani suits one month and modernist paintings or postmodernist installations the next proves nothing until we are told in what sense all these things are art and why. Obviously, the statement, perfume is art, is trivially true in the sense that it is clearly an art. It is also trivially true in the sense that few would object to placing it in one of those middling categories like applied art or design. But the claim by some perfumers and the Museum of Arts and Design that perfume belongs in the category of high art along with traditional painting, sculpture, and music requires some reasons. So let's see if we can help them out. One way to see what reasons there might be is a kind of via negativa, namely to answer the existing case against odors in general and perfume in particular as a vehicle for high art. At the heart of the case against perfumes is the claim that they lack the structural complexity to express either cognitive content or emotions. Now, a couple of quotes that I'm sure you're all familiar with. The incapacity to express meaning, memorably put by Monroe Beardsley, that tastes and smells lack, quote, balance, climax, development, or pattern, which is why there are no taste symphonies or smell sonatas. With respect to the expression of emotion, Frank Sibley, who was more positive about the aesthetic interest of taste and smells, still claimed that, quote, perfumes and flavors are necessarily limited. Unlike the major arts, they have no expressive connection with emotions, love or hate, death, grief, joy. So, what sorts of reasons could be mounted on behalf of the cognitive and expressive possibilities of perfumes? To begin with, I would argue that perfumes manifest cognitive penetrability, to use a nice phrase King Todd coined. First of all, due to differential volatilities of the various odor materials making up a perfume, the completed scent not only has a vertical structure, but a horizontal or temporal aspect as well, something also true of wine. Making a perfume, as a number of perfumers have said, is not so much a matter of blending odors as it is of composing with them. In calling what they do composing, perfumers are not just reaching for the association with a prestigious art form. What they mean is that they must imagine and then work out a structure involving what is commonly called top notes, heart notes, and base notes. identified roughly in terms of descending volatility, with the top notes evaporating first. These groups of notes are made up of what are called accords, themselves made up of individual elements. And part of what gives perfume its intellectual as well as sensory interest is the way this complex compositional structure results in an experience of variety and unity over time. The perfumer Jean-Claude Elena puts it, the components of a perfume are not like separate words strung out to make a sentence, but, quote, coexist and continue to express themselves individually, while at the same time forming a new order, a new meaning. Naturally, the average person who sniffs a perfume blotter for a moment, or even someone who wears a perfume day after day, may not be able to discriminate, let alone recognize most of the ingredients and the patterns they form. As in the case of wine, both discrimination and recognition require considerable training and experience. Moreover, professional perfume makers and judges have developed a shared, specialized vocabulary to facilitate communication. As Jean-Claude Elena puts it again, for the perfumer, terms like aldehyde, jasmine, or leather describe the odor, not the object. Moreover, the odor of jasmine that comes to mind for a perfumer is likely to be different from the fragrance given off by the jasmine flowers you and I may know. Since the scent of a flower like jasmine is made up of hundreds of different odor molecules, and the jasmine absolute derived from southern France is likely to differ from that coming from India. Although the creators of perfumes must develop finely honed powers of discrimination and recognition, perfume design itself, according to most perfumers, does not require a particularly outstanding physical endowment for smell. More important is the mental discipline to train powers of discrimination and memory. As the perfumer Edmund Rudnitska put it, quote, I do not compose perfumes with my nose, but with my brain. And even if I were to lose my power of smell, I could still invent and compose perfumes. In addition to seeing themselves as composers who build what they call accords, there's another parallel between perfumery and music. Most perfumers' ultimate goal is not to mix several ingredients in order to produce a single olfactory artifact, but ultimately to arrive at a formula that can be reproduced, much as the composer of a piano sonata does not aim at producing a single sound artifact, but wants to produce a score. Here, of course, philosophers might busy themselves with the olfactory version of a type token discussion for music. Is the work of perfume, art, the formula, or the odorous substance produced from it? Actually, I find the parallels between perfume composition and fashion or product design even closer. Like the perfume designer, the product or fashion designer might make her own physical prototype, but her ultimate aim is to produce a design, not an artifact. The sleek modernist chair that we admire at the Museum of Modern Art in New York or the Victorian Albert in London is a token of the design created by Marcel Breuer, just as the vapor from a bottle of Trésor that we sniff at a perfume counter is but a token of the formula created by Sophia Grossman. Okay. Pause. Now, if these remarks suffice to show that perfumes do have formal structure, is it a kind of structure capable of expressing both meaning and emotions? Let's begin with the expression of meaning. Perfumes seem quite capable of representation and symbolism, since even many natural odors carry associations and can be used to exemplify. Thus, citrus odors have a brightness and lightness that has made them useful in symbolizing cleanliness and alertness, so they show up not only in detergents or hand soaps, but also as notes in certain colognes for men. The perfumer John Caldelena, again, has created perfumes that use these more obvious kinds of association and exemplification to seek ways of symbolizing places, such as using green tea odors as part of a perfume evoking the idea of Japan, or mango odors, aromas to suggest Egypt in his perfume, An Island of the Nile. But he has also attempted something more complex and ambitious, namely, quote, to tell a story about a place through the structure of a perfume. He gives this example of how he composed a perfume called Un Jardin en Méditerranée. On a visit to a beautiful aromatic garden in Tunisia one day, he watched a young woman tear a fig leaf and sniff it with pleasure. And on his return to France, he attempted to create an olfactory representation of his experience of the garden. Given her current headspace technology, he could have gone back and sampled the garden to reproduce its ambient odors, or he could have replicated the specific odor of the fig. But that kind of literalism, he remarks, would be like a tourist snapshot that misses what he calls, quote, the emotional tone of the place. He likens such a figurative approach to the work of 19th century perfumers whose floral scents were pretty mixtures of natural essences, but not, he says, creations of the mind. So instead of trying to replicate the garden's odors, he tried to compose a perfume that would, quote, evoke a poetic memory of the garden. His completed perfume was built upon an intense bass note derived from a combination of, I'm going to quote stuff here I don't understand, but maybe you will. Stenone, an aroma of crumpled mint leaves, and gamma octalactone, an aroma similar to fruity plum. These two were to be balanced by, quote, a lighter pair of ingredients, hedione, giving off a fresh flower scent, and ISOE, which has a woody, spicy structure. I'm sure you can just smell it already. In reading Elena's account of, actually, since I have it here, I thought of bringing it down and spraying it on a perfume blotter, but if any of you would like to take a little whiff, you can judge for yourself. Careful, it lasts a while. But if we smell up the room, it'll be rather nice. And we're in the Mediterranean after all. Okay. I can smell it up here already. In reading Elena's account of how he conceived and composed a Mediterranean garden, I was struck by two things. First, he sought to achieve what we might call cognitive expressivity by using artificially constructed odors that would retain sufficient identity to provide relevant associations with Mediterranean plants, as well as an interest in the way they work together within the whole. Secondly, his comment about the failure of a literal reproduction of an odor to capture, quote, the emotional tone of the place, suggests a creative intention not unlike that of some writers, composers, and painters. The issue, of course, is not whether Elena's perfume succeeds in communicating the ideas and emotional tone he intended. I don't know if any of you felt Mediterranean garden as you sniffed it. but after all, the reviews are mixed from what I've been able to find. The point is, philosophically, that many fine perfumes are intentionally structured in a way that seeks to be expressive of both ideas and feelings, and also that those who appreciate them view them as attempts at expression. And they can discuss with each other whether the perfumer succeeded or not. This expressive potential of the best perfumes is parallel to what Kane Todd says of fine wines, namely that they, quote, have expressive properties that are not reducible to mere association, since, quote, the recognition of intention in wine can suffice to turn mere association into expression. As Todd points out, this kind of intentional expressivity has similarities to the expressivities of pure instrumental music. Although, much as I enjoy these fragrances, I doubt if even the most complex and interesting perfumes can come close to what is possible in the best instrumental music. Yet, we should still keep in mind that Western culture not only has a long tradition of expressive music, but a musical public trained to listen to it, whereas olfactory education and knowledge is scant at best. As people become more discriminating and experienced at deciphering scent structures, they may discover far richer possibilities of expression than heretofore believed. Nevertheless, perfume as we now know it does have a serious handicap that has to be dealt with if we're going to answer Sibley's charge that it can't express really powerful emotions like love or hate or death. After all, perfumes in the normal meaning of fragrances to wear on the body as part of one's self-expression have seldom been intended to express the dark emotions like the smell of fear or the stench of death. This limitation of perfume qua perfume is confirmed by reading what many established perfumers have said in explaining why they believe perfume is art. First, most of them claim that what makes perfume art is its quest for beauty. Second, beauty is defined as harmony. Of course, the term complexity is as favored as the term balance among perfumers, and the presence of odors that pique, singe, or startle is the olfactory equivalent of strong spices in food. Yet few indeed are perfumes that are deliberately disgusting. That is because, in the third place, the response most perfumers hope to evoke is one of pleasure. Some, like Elena, say their aim is to, quote, enchant, to charm, to arouse sensual pleasure. Others, like Edmund Rudnitska, claim that the pleasure sought is a more intellectual one, and he even cites Kant's distinction between the merely agreeable and the aesthetic. But if most perfumes are not meant to express the emotions of fear, despair, or disgust, one could imagine there might be an avant-garde perfumer emerge who would try to capture the smell of fear or the stench of death. Of course, we don't have to wait for such a perfumer. We could turn to artists, since there are a number of olfactory artists who have already explored the less savory side of olfactory experience. So it's time now to turn to a comparison between perfume compositions and contemporary olfactory art. I will leave aside most installation and performance works, even, regrettably, Peter de Coupere's Olfactiano, on which he has played a scent sonata. So put that in your pipe and smoke it, Monroe Beardsley. I will focus instead on perfume-like scent compositions, either created or commissioned by artists. The Canadian artist Clara Orsiti, for example, has been a pioneer in commissioning single scents derived from body odor or genital smells. But this morning I want to use Cecil Tolas, who has explored a wide range of unpleasant odors and her missionary zeal to get people to appreciate the real odors around them, no matter how noxious. Over the last 2 decades, she has collected more than 7,000 odors of every kind, ranging from many types of dog droppings and dirty socks to dried fish and rotten bananas. But most relevant to our present concern, she has also tried to create olfactory compositions that capture both the smell of fear and the stench of death. Her stench of death experiment came as a commission from the German Museum of Military History in Dresden that wanted their exhibitions to have a realistic battlefield odor, including the smell of blood and dead bodies. The odor she came up with was evidently so successful that the museum decided not to use it after all. Her fear of smell composition, on the other hand, was part of an installation piece for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Art Center in 2006, a piece she called The Smell of Fear and the Fear of Smell. It was based on sweat samples from men who were subject to anxiety attacks and found themselves in a fear-inducing situation. She actually constructed a little thing they wore under their arms when they knew they were going to get scared. She worked a selection of 9 of these into a paint that released the odor molecules when gallery visitors touched the walls. Although Tolas herself has not tried to turn any of these smells into a commercial perfume, she did show up once at a Brazilian ambassador's reception in Berlin wearing one of these smell of fear scents, and created a bit of a sensation. Now, if Tolas has not been interested in making commercial perfumes, other artists have. The New York artist Kiki Smith wanted a traditional fragrance under her name and had a perfumer put together smells she liked, such as patchouli, sandalwood, musk, and boxwood, accented with notes of chamomile, fig, and blackcurrant. Issued in a limited edition of 4,000 bottles in 2010, the perfume, called just Kiki, is sold in New York's New Museum. Much more interesting for our purposes, I think, is the perfume called Revolution Pipe Bomb, conceived by the social activist artist Lisa Kirk. The elixir is based on Kirk's survey of a number of journalists and political radicals who were asked what a revolution smells like. And they responded: smoke, gasoline, tear gas, burnt rubber, and decaying flesh. Kirk then asked Simrise Perfumers Company to make a perfume expressing these odors, and also asked a well-known jeweler to create a vessel shaped like a pipe bomb, but made of precious metals. The initial edition of only 28 pipe bombs included 3 in platinum, 5 in gold, 20 in silver at prices ranging from $4,000 to $48,000. Obviously, the filthy capitalists were to buy these bombs. Some of them were initially shown as part of an art installation at the Museum of Modern Art's PS1 Art Center in New York in 2008. Then, in 2010, under the shortened title Revolution, Kirk released a cheaper glass bottle version of the same scent, which contains notes of birch tar, ambergris, leather, musk, and I warn you, you probably won't love it, and definitely don't spill any on yourself. Some people who bought this perfume hated it, but others said that although the initial scent reminded them of burnt rubber, they came to like it, since it was both dark, edgy, yet strangely wearable. I couldn't get my wife to wear any. Well, what are we to make of the scent compositions of Tolas and the actual perfumes commissioned by Smith and Kirk? And what do these artworks tell us about the claim that perfume is art? Well, first, it seems to me Tolas and Kirk's experiments show that the vehicle of odor has a much greater potentiality for expressing the full range of olfactory experience than is permitted to ordinary perfumes. We've got the smell of fear, the stench of death, and all sorts of stinky things in between. Second, I believe Tolas and Kirk's works, at least, show why perfumes as ordinarily produced and appreciated do not fit easily into the category of contemporary art. To explain this second point, however, I will need an analytical framework for understanding the nature of artistic production and reception. The model I propose is an adaptation of ideas developed over the last decade by David Davies and Peter Lamarck. In particular, some of their views on the interrelation of four concepts: vehicle, medium, intention, and practice. Obviously, a vehicle in today's art world can be anything, including gestures and statements, and of course, odors. But the vehicle of odors only becomes an artistic medium through an artist's intention as carried out within the context of a particular kind of artistic practice. By intention here, I understand a conscious aim, although not always articulated, a conscious aim to express ideas or feelings and to have that cognitive or affective content received by an audience in a way established by one or another artistic practice. By artistic practice, I mean some art form, such as painting, conceptual installation, or performance art, insofar as these are constituted by sets of beliefs, behavioral norms, institutions, and histories that are shared by both artists and audiences. Naturally, the elements of such practices are always subject to ongoing revisions and are affected by the introduction of new practices, yet they still retain a kind of working identity. Now, I recognize that may have gone by kind of fast, but I hope as I apply this model, it'll become clearer. Okay, I'll begin with Cecil Tolas composing an odor complex that included the stench of death. Now, one can easily imagine Tolas or some other artist using this scent as part of an installation piece dealing with war. Yet the actual context of practice informing her intention was not the context of some contemporary art practice, but the context of Tolas' own olfactory consultancy practice, a practice that has included composing things like the scent of Sweden to be pumped into IKEA stores. On the other hand, her work, The Smell of Fear and The Fear of Smell, took the vehicle of sweat odors and intentionally transformed them into a medium within the practice of installation art. And she then showed that work in an art venue on the assumption that people familiar with installation practices would know how to respond to it. Now, when we come to wearing the fear of smell to an ambassadorial reception, the question is whether this act was intended to be an artwork. The answer is a little more ambiguous. Superficially, her act of wearing the smell of fear resembles some works of olfactory performance art, such as Angela Ellsworth's 1997 piece entitled Actual Odor, which involved Ellsworth wearing a dress that she had soaked in her own urine to an art opening. But given the way Tolas recounts her episode of wearing the smell of fear, the act seems to have been intended more as an instance of her olfactory consciousness-raising practice rather than an instance of performance art practice, although obviously she could combine those two. 2. By considering 3 of Tola's scent compositions in terms of the concepts of vehicle, medium, intention, and practice as described above, it turns out that only the smell of fear installation seems to have been unambiguously anchored within the context of a contemporary art practice. As for how her various scent compositions relate to perfumes, as normally understood, given her zeal to make people attend to the actual odor of their bodies and surroundings, it's understandable that Tolas herself has not attempted to transform any of her scent compositions into a marketable perfume. Not so the other 2 artists we've considered. Each of them commissioned a perfume to be marketed. Yet I believe that the defining context of practice for each commission was quite different. Although Kiki Smith is a well-known artist, and the perfume bearing the name Kiki is sold in an art museum store, those facts by themselves do not automatically mean that her intention in having the perfume made was an artistic intention. Of course, she could have intended the perfume to be part of her total body of artworks, but she did not offer any statement or gesture that would indicate she meant it so understood, that she meant it, for example, to be an instance of conceptual art and to be regarded and judged that way. Since her commissioning of the perfume seems to have no other point than to offer the world another perfume, the intention and practice involved seems little different from the intention of practice of other celebrities who commission a perfume to appear under her name. Her perfume is no more a work of art than the cologne bearing Michael Jordan's name is an instance of sport. The intention behind Lisa Kirk's 2010 perfume, Revolution, that you've enjoyed, is clearly rooted in her artistic practice. That's because her intention to have a scent composed and sold as a perfume was itself subsidiary to the context of the practice of participatory art. As her website says, in a bit of jargon, but here it is, Lisa Kirk's practice investigates the contradictions of consumerism and the aestheticization of political radical signifiers and current events. Teaching a lot of theory in art school these days. Even more important, her procedure in executing the project reflects a complex relation between 2 levels of intention. On a first level, by commissioning Simtech to simulate the particular smell she did, Kirk intended Simtech to turn the vehicle of odors into a medium belonging to a commercial art practice, perfume, with the perfume to be purchased and worn. But this first level intention was simultaneously enveloped in a second level intention that treated the resulting perfume itself as a vehicle which Kirk transformed into an art medium by an intention that made the perfume an instance of contemporary participatory art practice. Thus, those who buy and wear, or at least sniff, the pipe bomb perfume or the bottled perfume become participants in an overall art project we have all participated in, Lisa Kirk's art project today. We have become participants in an overall art project aimed at raising consciousness of what Kirk calls, quote, contradictions of consumerism and the aestheticization of revolutionary signifiers. Kirk's Revolution perfume project can help us answer at least one form of the question, is perfume art? Even the finest perfumes, as such works are normally conceived, created, and consumed, are not of themselves, of course, instances of contemporary high art. We can make this even clearer, I think, with a little thought experiment. Suppose there was a perfumer, let's call him Che, who happened to be a disenchanted revolutionary, And let's suppose Che one day, working for a big perfume company, thought, I'll bet the market could stand to support a perfume that smelled of burning rubber, tear gas, dead bodies, and so on, and we could call it Revolution, and it would be a big hit. In short, let's suppose Che composes a perfume that is perceptually identical in olfactory and visual terms to the one Kirk conceived and commissioned. Would Che's perfume, called Revolution, be a work of contemporary high art? I don't think so. It would still be a work of commercial art, a perfume conceived with the intention of being marketed, purchased, and evaluated as other perfumes are. In short, it would be part of a practice of perfumery, a practice that has its own set of beliefs and norms, its own specialized vocabulary, its routes of circulation, its institutions, and its history. What Che's intention lacked was that second level of intention by which Lisa Kirk turned the perfume Syntec had made for her into an art medium in the context of contemporary participatory art practice. Okay. In emphasizing the differences between the intentions and practices of perfumery as currently understood and the intentions and practices of contemporary installation and participation art, I've not forgotten my previous argument that the best perfumes are capable of far greater cognitive and expressive achievements than is usually thought, and are accordingly deserving of respect as an art form. The question is, what kind of art form? As we've seen, not only the curator of the Art of Scent exhibition, but many perfumers themselves believe perfumes are a fine art form equal to painting, sculpture, music, and so on, by virtue of beauty and harmony. And now, if we were willing to accept Gerard Levinson's concept of the role of intention in making something art, namely that a person intends their work to be taken in the same way as some artwork in the past was taken, we'd have to grant that many perfumes are indeed part of traditional fine art. Looked at from Levinson's perspective, all I've shown is that perfume doesn't fit into the practices of some contemporary art forms. I believe, on the contrary, that the overall context of perfumery and the practice of fine arts like painting, sculpture, and music also differ in the same way as perfumery differs from contemporary art. And what is that? The limitation of perfumes as a possible art form is that they are design arts, namely a practice of composing scents that have the function of being worn on the body to enhance self-presentation. It is that function which largely rules out perfumes that express experiences of despair, hatred, or death, or are repulsive, nauseous, or harmful to the skin. Of course, astringent and repellent scents could be worn by a shaman or prophet or a Sifiltolis, nor should we foreclose the possibility that future changes in the normal practice of perfumery might make us all more sophisticated and open to a wider range of olfactory experience. Yet I believe whatever changes occur in the scope and character of perfume practice, one obvious and fundamental difference between perfume design and so-called high art practices is likely to remain. There are two sides to the difference. From the point of view of production, the perfume designer, like other designers, has to consider the practical needs and interests of those for whom perfumes are designed. Whereas contemporary artist is free to do or to make or to have made anything in any way for any reason. Correspondingly, from the point of view of reception, it is always legitimate to ask of a work of design whether, in addition to its artistic and aesthetic qualities, it adequately serves the practical function for which it was designed. Whereas, of course, works of art are not expected to serve any practical need, but to be appreciated for themselves for their intrinsic cognitive and expressive qualities. Obviously, an individual designer including a perfumer, may throw off constraints of service and shift into the role of an artist working with one or another mode of art practice, just as an individual artist may shift into the role of a designer and accept the constraints of certain practical needs. And as Alex Coles has emphasized in some recent books, there have been many hybrids of art and design, and such experiments have seemed to increase over recent decades. That is the kernel of truth in the frequently heard claim that the boundaries between art and design, or art and craft, have blurred. Such talk about blurred boundaries is fine, so long as it doesn't become an excuse not to think. Maybe I should quit there because I'm out of time.
Thanks very much, Larry.
You have your microphone for answering questions, and as people want to ask questions, I'll pass the microphone to people in the audience. Okay, so.
I have two questions. So one is, the first is just for clarification about your views. So is it right that you think perfumes in general, because of this lack of the right second order intention, and because of the current practices governing their commercial and design nature, are generally not to be considered as contemporary artworks, but that they can be if they're designed with the right intention, and lack those commercial constraints, so like the work of, sorry, I keep forgetting her name, Tolas, is that right? Okay. So then the second question is about the role of intention here, and how it relates to the sort of cognitive complexity and expressive capacities that you talked about. So, is it, I mean, you can imagine that Che Guevara's perfume,
Right.
by your definition, doesn't count as, say, or the definition, the model you're following, doesn't count as art, because it lacks that second order intention. But it might actually be more successful on a cognitively complex and expressive level than, for instance, its properly artistic equivalent. So you might have the same two products, I'm imagining, exactly the same odors.
Exactly.
One has the intention, one lacks the intention, but actually the one that lacks the intention, although it ceases to be an artwork or a high artwork, I mean, however the distinction is supposed to run, and yet is actually much more cognitively and expressively sophisticated. Is that possible? So I guess the question is, what is the role of intention in grounding this kind of cognitive complexity and expressive capacity?
Yeah, I'm taking intention here as as being somewhat complex in that someone like, take the case that we have here, the Revolution perfume. She intends to have an odor that smells like revolution. But that's only part of her intention. There's then the what I call the second level of intention, which is that that odor will be used in such a way that it will draw attention to the issues of commercialism, aestheticizing revolution, and so on. I don't know if it's a very profound work of art, but it's the one that we have. Whereas in the thought experiment, the disillusioned revolutionary doesn't go beyond that first intention, which is, let's have a perfume that gives the smell of revolution. So I imagine the two are literally identical. They look the same, they smell the same. It's, I don't know if you know Peter Lamarck's work and object, is your object and work. where he has a very, I'm kind of piggybacking on that idea that you can have this same object. I mean, his memorable example, I think, is take the Mona Lisa. So we imagine a doomsday scenario, that famous hydrogen bomb that evaporates all of us, but everything else is left. And so the Mona Lisa is still hanging in the Louvre, but it's no longer a work. It's just an object, because a work requires not only, you know, an audience that understands the artistic intention and the entire context of things. In its own way, it's a bit of an institutional view, but it's much richer than the kind of Dickian procedural thing. So does that help with
Well, thank you for a very interesting talk. I hope you'll be publishing that soon. I was very much taken up by your idea about how fine art became well, theorized in discourse in the 18th century. And you mentioned how museums began to collect art. Also at that time, academies and schools were first kind of formulated, taking over for the guild structure that had been prominent earlier. So there were these other kinds of institutions as well on the production side.
Mm-hmm.
So my question then relates to how do you see an olfactory discrimination being developed, not only in terms of collection, but also in training and educating and you know, training the consumers or the recipients of olfactory art?
Well, actually, I ran out of time. At the end of my talk, I go back to the exhibition because I've kind of been hard on this, but Chandler Burrs is not an intellectual or a philosopher and so on, and so I don't want to beat up on him too hard. The exhibition, it seemed to me, with its grandiose claims and its, you know, let's try to arrange this so nobody will remember that perfumes are perfumes. He forbade the use of the word perfume, you know, anywhere in the exhibit. But there is a good side to that in that it does the very thing that museums have always done since the 18th century, which is they decontextualize works that were originally created to be part of worship or political symbols and so on, and just focus on their formal qualities. And so in a way, that's what that exhibit did. It was a step toward olfactory education. And they, I'll hand it around. They actually had a second room. Take a look at the little brochure with the art stuff and cards. I mean, I didn't know anything about perfume when I started working on this. I was irritated by the hoopla, you know, of the Museum of Art and Design, and it got me thinking about it. And if you want, I don't know how long the odor will last, but you just peel back the little plastic.
Well, how would you distinguish then this kind of word association that was going on in that room from education proper that occurs in schools versus kind of market research that
Market research.
that happens through industry practices?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think it probably, like a lot of other art education that museums do, they can, you know, they will put on little seminars for people you want on art history and color and so on. I mean, I'm not very hopeful for olfactory education in the United States anyway. We can't even keep music and visual art in the curriculum in the public schools. The first thing that gets cut. So I can just see arriving at the Board of Ed and saying, well, I know you just eliminated music, so, but let's have there are institutions do it. The Getty Museum did a thing for kids in the Los Angeles area to come in, and they actually made perfumes. So I just think it was done, but I guess from a philosophical point of view, what interests me here is this. Question of the sort of the breakdown of the traditional dichotomy, and yet when push comes to shove, the traditional dichotomy pops up again.
Well, do you think
maybe
Chandler's...
it's there, you know.
But do you think Chandler's exercise then will lead to commercial perfume being considered a fine art?
Oh, I think, you know, as I say, many people who attended the exhibition thought it was, agreed with him. And someone like Edmund Rudnitska, I don't know, he must be up in years now, because the book I quoted from was a 1960s or 70s book. It was an entire book devoted to the aesthetics of perfume. He had studied Kant, and I was astonished. There's a perfumer who's reading Kant because he really believes that what he's doing is parallel to what people have been doing in the fine arts.
And how is the reaction of people to this revolution smell? Do people really think it really resembles revolution in a sense? Or?
People, did they?
The audience, for example, all of you. What do you think about this?
Oh yeah, that smelled like revolution. It stank, I would say.
I expected it to stink more.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it wasn't quite as...
tear gas has it really...
Yeah, it should make you weep.
Cry.
Yeah, I believe it.
I can follow on from Marta's question that I think it's an interesting thing about bad smells or smells that aren't pleasant.
Oh yeah.
Is that sometimes they are just very unpleasant, but sometimes they have a degree of fascination to them. So I'm sort of wondering what your thoughts are on that, because I also thought revolution wasn't, I was really worried about spilling on me.
Yeah.
but I thought it was just actually, not particularly pleasant, but it was still interesting. Does that make it, what does that make it in terms of its value? Is that negative value? Is it mixed? What do you think? How would you try to analyze its aesthetic value?
It's aesthetic value. Yeah. Yeah, we really don't have a very good vocabulary for negative aesthetic value. The only thing I know that I've gotten from reading.
Just following from that, it seems that the container of the perfume becomes really important. The bottling,
right,
in terms of its intentional audience, and you have, the glass one, which is sort of available. But if there's a pipe, is this the same as the pipe bomb perfume? Is it
the content is the same?
Okay, but then you have like the models in gold and for $48,000, which are really going to the collector's market. This idea of perhaps co-opting a revolutionary affect within the art market by collectors and so forth. Is this something that perhaps fueled your irritation, this idea? I'm curious about your irritation, actually.
My irritation? Well, I wasn't irritated, at least at first. I just thought it was very clever of her, although I'm sure it's not clear to me. She's supposedly a socially activist artist and doing cutting edge things of that nature, but it seemed to me, in a way, she's obviously making fun of the rich collectors who buy the Revolution pipe bomb perfume for their collection. But at the same time, it seems to me she's making fun of the revolutionaries. She's supposedly commenting on the aestheticizing of revolution, but at the same time, she's aestheticizing it herself. So it's an interesting work in that sense of crossing these. Yeah.
Well, this is interesting because I wrote an article on artists who bottle a city, who distill the essence of a city. And of course, there have been many perfumes that have operated on that idea. But the point I was making, that what made these artworks different, these kind of olfactory creations different, was precisely that they incorporated unpleasant smells, abject scents, and pollution, and so forth. And when I communicated with Helgard Haug, which you've written about as well, she worked with a professional perfumer, to make her essence of the Alexanderplatz in Berlin. She said she had to fight against the assumptions of the perfumer to make something sweet and pleasurable.
Yeah.
So she had to really maintain this insistence to incorporate, urine smell and the kind of coal dust, the brake dust that one smells in a subway, and all the ozone from exhaust and so forth. They give it its particular characteristic. Mm-hmm. So perfumers are inherently or kind of socialized within the perfume industry to make something that's pleasurable.
Practice with its own ethos.
And so it's no surprise that that the Revolution perfume still has a mellow note, which I was completely surprised that was still quite melodious in its overall sensation.
Yeah, good point.
Of course, as well, many perfumes use urine odors within them anyway, so maybe it's proportion about which.
Oh yeah. Civet. The musk and those things. If you take them pure, are pretty repulsive until mixed. Well, one of the things I didn't say but wanted to about the play-off between design or applied arts and fine arts is that while we keep saying, well, the difference is breaking down, but then we keep bringing it up again when we talk about these things. But one of the problems is that these are art becomes used as what's his name, the linguist talked about super categories. Who's at Oxford? I'm blanking on his name. But he argued that there are certain categories: art, religion, politics, law, that are working as these kind of super categories up here. And the problem is that if you think of fine art or something like that, it's so obvious that many particular instances of perfume, wine, fine cuisine are far more complex, expressive, subtle than innumerable paintings, banal conceptual works. I mean, I find a lot of conceptual art really stimulating and interesting, but I would say that about half the conceptual pieces I run into don't have much concept. It's just, you know, so I'd rather have a glass of fine wine than waste my time on banal conceptual art. Yeah.
Just wondering about this.
So you said, you know, philosophers and others keep trying to blur this distinction between art and non-art, or high art and low art, or whatever. And it keeps coming back. I mean, I guess one of the interesting things about perfumes, I don't know what you think about this, is that, I mean, so the general function of perfumes, I guess, historically, is to be more or less sexually attractive to, you know, to a member of the opposite sex, or to anybody else for that matter. And I suppose they often work at in a way, a subconscious or a subpersonal level, just in the way that sort of pheromones attract. And so I suppose there's just fundamentally a functional aspect to odor that governs the way in which perfumes have always been made and the way in which they're supposed to function, that really, in your terms, makes it very hard for them to break this obstacle into the higher art, because they're designed specifically in a way not to draw too much attention to themselves. And I suppose one of the functions of an object, once it becomes regarded as art or intended to be art, is to draw your attention to qualities you might otherwise not have noticed, which is what makes, you know, fine wines, for instance, so interesting. And perfumes are particularly difficult just because their function seems to be, if not the opposite, certainly far short of that, because their attractiveness consists partly in their subtlety and in not maybe being overly noticed. Or, I mean, I don't know, that's just off the top of my head, but... Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. There are so many different aspects of it that I want to talk to you about, so I'm not going to ask you questions now, and I'm just very pleased that we've got 2 days that we can discuss some of these issues in length at various different times. So what I'll kind of ask you now, from my whole list of questions I have, is, I suppose again, it's a clarification issue, and it's around the example, I don't know if you've seen the Essence de Meistenbroek, which is, it's an essence that was based on a little village in the Netherlands, and it's kind of one of these, it's only really a tiny township with probably about 20 houses, farms mainly. But these particular types of areas in the Netherlands are under a lot of threat. So there was an artist that was working with one particular one, Meistenbroek, in trying to highlight this factor, and worked with the residents of that area in developing a perfume, an essence, that could then, a little vial of it could be given to everybody who left, so they could take it away and people could smell it and experience Meistenbroek. And again, it wasn't an accurate kind of distillation of the smell, but really the idea of the place. Now it's sold on the internet for about €100 a bottle. Is that art? High art? If it is, does it then shift from being high art at some point? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I do, you know, I mean, my last remarks were just sort of this whole business that we are in the habit of saying, if we can shift X from the category of applied art or decorative art to high art, we have elevated it. To me, that is meaningless. I mean, I realize, sure, these are cultural values that we place, you know, a very high value on it, economically and culturally and so on. But it seems to me to make a lot more sense to think of what we call art, contemporary art and contemporary design, as 2 different practices, not that one is higher or lower than the other. They're just different in certain beliefs, aims, and so on. And I think that's the truth in the notion that, well, these boundaries are disappearing, they're breaking down, and so on. But it's just so strange to me, and I don't know if it's that strange, but they keep, they're right under the surface. And, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe take a little bit of a contrary view, and for a reason. I'd like to ask, what are the stakes then of considering perfume in art? I mean, ultimately. I would agree with you on a discursive and philosophical level that no, perfume is not quite an art. And as one perfumer said to me at a conference, well, when perfumers do make perfumes on their own time, then it will be an art. Most perfumers, they go home at 5 o'clock and then call it a day, and move on.
Right.
So even within the perfume industry, they know what's not art. But what are ultimately the stakes? Art is not a zero-sum game. Where if you add one more entity into the art world, someone else has to go. The art world has been often the case, very accepting and inclusive of numerous forms of art. At one point, so-called primitive art wasn't ethnographic art was not considered art. Art by insane individuals, for instance, has been brought in to the realm. So, I mean, there's been many disadvantaged or peripheral populations that have been brought into the art world through various kinds of, and then like photography, also video, audio, and performance, and many other things. So, for me, what are the ultimate stakes? In my reading of the criticism of Burr's show, well, usually the stakes for this discussion of whether it's high art or not kind of lead to a form of exclusion. And so, and since perfume is now the most evident example of an olfactory kind of experience, what I'm concerned about is that if we as philosophers and estheticians disclaim perfume from the realm of art, this is going to lead to a broader negation of the possibilities for olfactory art in general, just because perfume is, it's such a big player in most people's olfactory experience. So I guess that's my question. Yes, we can discuss this philosophically,
right.
But what would be the practical effects of excluding perfume?
Well, I spent a good deal of time in the talk trying to argue the case for perfume being a very complex, expressive medium and so on. So I have no problem with it as part of design art. That's why I was saying, to me, art, if you want, in its contemporary practices of installation, performance, whatever, and design are on the same level. So I don't, they are both part of art with a smaller A or a middle-sized A or whatever, in my mind. So it's just, I was trying to sort out in what way, what kind of art is it, and but I think that's why I talked to your first point. That's why I talked about the process of assimilation, which I traced in a book about a decade ago. That this process, I mean, it's fascinating to me that it is, as you say, it's one way. We never boot something out of the category of art. I mean, if the museums were serious about, when they start accepting something that wasn't there before, retrospectively, they would have to be humongous hangar-sized warehouses of everything from the past. Because then jewelry, all the jewelry of the past, all the fiber arts, all the knitting, all the coverlets, it's all art. Well, it should all be there. So there's some practice.
I mean, this is really interesting. I think this question of training, I think the question of practice and the distinction between the applied art and fine art that you're identifying. Because there is this move in universities now towards a more corporate model of universities, and sort of this moving perhaps towards a more applied art model for certain kinds of training. So if we were to consider the question of, say, an olfactory art, I think that the discourses within which it gets framed are really important. And I think they're different from fine art, which usually works within a visual art analysis or visual art discourse, from this applied art, which is sort of is a little bit more inscribed by industry protocols, perhaps, or questions of design and management and production and that sort of thing. And I just wanted to invite you to speculate a little bit about perhaps the distinction for an olfactory art. How would you envision it as a applied art in terms of certain kinds of programs, and on the other hand as a fine art?
Well, what comes to mind in listening to what you said is this much broader reach of what they refer to as perfumery, which is, I understand why Chandler Burr wanted to get rid of the word, because it doesn't have a very sophisticated ring. Perfumery, what do you work in? I work in perfumery. The images that come to mind. But what these people are doing, is they're flavoring half of the food we eat. They're providing ambient odors in the buildings we work and visit. It's amazing the odor molecules that go into the things that you use every day. Including car tires. Your anthology includes stuff that talks about that. So the reach of it as applied art is astonishing. The fine perfume in the beautiful bottle is just the tip of the iceberg of all olfactory